I never believed in ghosts, not until I entered that place. It all started with a dare. My friends and I had always been curious about the old asylum that sat on the outskirts of our small town. People said it was haunted and strange things had happened there, but we didn't believe it. Or at least, I didn't. I thought it was all just stories people told to scare each other. One night, we were sitting around a fire, talking about the asylum again. My friend, Jake, turned to me and said, "I bet you won't go inside." I laughed. Why wouldn't I? It is just an old building. There's nothing scary about it. "I'm serious," Jake said. "Spend one night in there, alone. If you do, I will pay you $100. The others chimed in, daring me, teasing me. It wasn't about the money for me, though. I just wanted to prove that I wasn't afraid, so I said yes. The asylum had been abandoned 4 years. No one went near it anymore. The windows were broken, the walls were cracked, and the whole place looked like it was ready to collapse. But I wasn't scared, at least not at first. I packed a flashlight, some snacks, and a bottle of water, and headed to the asylum that night. My friends stayed outside, laughing and joking as I walked up to the front door. "Good luck," Jake shouted after me. I turned back and waved, trying to act brave. But the moment I stepped inside, something changed. The air was thick, cold, and the silence was so heavy. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The sound echoed through the empty halls, sending a chill down my spine. I shook it off and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, with a loud bang, making me jump. I told myself it was just the wind. It is just a building, I whispered to myself. There is no such thing as ghosts. I took a deep breath and turned on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing long, empty hallways that stretched out in every direction. Dust floated in the air, and the floorboards creaked under my feet. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but I pushed the thought away. I had only been in the building for a few minutes, but already I wanted to leave. The silence inside the asylum was unbearable. It wasn't the normal kind of quiet you'd expect in an empty building. It was thick, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something. I walked down the main hallway, shining my flashlight over the crumbling walls. The air smelled damp and musty, like old wood and mildew. The windows were covered in grime, and broken glass crunched under my shoes. As I moved deeper into the asylum, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the atmosphere get to me. But every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see someone standing there, staring at me. But there was no one. I found a small room off to the side and decided to set up there for the night. The room was empty, except for an old metal bed frame and some rusty lockers. I sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, and pulled out my phone. No signal, of course. I wasn't surprised. The place felt like it had been forgotten by the world, like it existed in its own little pocket of time. As I sat there, I started to hear things. At first, it was just faint sounds, like footsteps or the creaking of the floorboards above me. But then, I heard something else, a whisper. It was so quiet I almost didn't notice it. But once I did, I couldn't ignore it. I stood up, shining my flashlight around the room. The whispering stopped. I laughed nervously. "It is nothing," I told myself, "just the wind." But deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. I stepped out of the room and back into the hallway. The whispering started again, this time louder. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the building. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. The hallway stretched on forever, or at least it felt that way. The further I walked, the more lost I became. Every turn led me to another identical hallway, and every door I tried was either locked or led to an empty room. The whispering followed me the entire time, growing louder and louder. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, a shadow moved. It was quick, darting out of sight before I could fully register what I had seen. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I took a step forward, then another. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, like someone was desperately trying to get my attention. My hands shook as I held the flashlight, the beam flickering slightly. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw it again, a shadow, slipping around the corner. "Wait," I called, my voice shaky. I hurried after it, turning the corner, but there was nothing there. The more I walked, the more I felt like the asylum was playing tricks on me. The hallways seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense, leading me back to places I'd already been. It was like the building itself was trying to confuse me, trying to keep me from finding my way out. The whispering voices were louder now, almost deafening. They seemed to be coming from all directions at once, surrounding me. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but the sound sent chills down my spine. I tried to block it out, to focus on finding a way out of the asylum, but no matter which way I turned, I ended up back in the same spot. I came to a large, open room that looked like it had once been a common area for the patients. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the furniture was broken and overturned. The air was thick with dust, and the windows were shattered, letting in the cold night air. I stood in the center of the room, shining my flashlight around. The whispering was louder here, more intense, it felt like. The voices were right next to me, like they were whispering directly into my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. My heart was racing, my palms sweaty. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself down. "It is just a building," I whispered to myself again. "There is no such thing as ghosts." But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do next, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting across the room. I turned quickly, shining my flashlight in the direction of the movement. There, in the far corner of the room, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, with long, bony arms and a face that was half hidden in shadow. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its mouth was twisted into a sinister grin. I froze, unable to move. The figure stared at me for a long moment, then slowly began to move toward me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure moved closer. Its eyes locked on mine. Then, I turned and ran. I sprinted down the hallway, my breath coming in short. Panicked gasps, my footsteps echoed off the walls, and I could hear the figure behind me. Its footsteps slow and deliberate. No matter how fast I ran, it seemed to be getting closer. I turned a corner and found myself in a small, cramped room. There was no way out. I was trapped. The figure appeared in the doorway, its twisted grin growing wider. I backed up against the wall, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight. The beam flickered, and for a moment, I thought the light would go out. The figure stepped into the room, its hollow eyes fixed on me. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Please, don't hurt me." The figure stopped, its grin fading. It tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. For a moment, there was silence. The whispering voices had stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at me. I screamed, throwing my hands up to protect myself. But then, the figure vanished. I stood there, shaking, and trying to make sense of what had just happened. The figure was gone. But the fear remained. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat. I needed to get out of there. I turned and ran back down the hallway, desperate to find an exit, but the asylum seemed to be changing around me. The hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. It was like the building itself was alive, like it was trying to trap me inside. The whispering voices started up again, louder than ever. They were all around me, surrounding me, growing more and more frantic. I ran faster, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. Finally, I saw a door up ahead. It was half open, and beyond it, I could see the faint glow of moonlight. I sprinted toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I was almost there, just a few more steps. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut. I skidded to a stop, my hand reaching out to grab the handle. I pulled, but the door wouldn't budge. Then, the whispering voices were deafening now, so loud that I couldn't think. I slammed my fists against the door, shouting for help, but no one came. I don't know how long I stood there, pounding on the door, screaming for someone to let me out. It felt like hours. My voice was hoarse, my hands bruised and bleeding from banging on the door. Finally, I gave up. I sank to the floor, my back against the door, and buried my face in my hands. Then, the whispering voices had quieted down, but they were still there, faint and persistent, like a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, too exhausted and terrified to move, and then something changed. The air in the room shifted, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin. I looked up, and to my shock, the door was open. I didn't stop to question it. I didn't want to know why or how it had opened. I just wanted to get out of there. I scrambled to my feet and ran through the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. The hallways were still dark and twisted, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, and my footsteps echoing off the walls. Finally, I saw it, the front door. I ran toward it, my legs burning, and my lungs screaming for air. I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door swung open, and I stumbled outside, gasping for a breath. Finally, I was free. I don't remember much about what happened after that. I must have run all the way back to my friends, because the next thing I knew, I was standing outside the asylum, panting and covered in sweat. Jake and the others were waiting for me, laughing and joking. They hadn't heard anything. They hadn't seen the figure. They hadn't heard the whispers. They thought it was all a joke, but I knew better. I never went back to the asylum after that. I didn't need to. The memory of that night is enough to keep me away. Sometimes, when I am lying in bed at night, I still hear the whispering voices. They are faint, barely audible, but they are there. I don't tell anyone about it, and they wouldn't believe me anyway, but I know the truth. The asylum is haunted, and I will never forget what I saw in there. It was a quiet morning when Ben and Emma decided to go on their camping trip. These two friends had always loved adventure, but this trip felt different. The forest they wanted to explore was near a small town that people rarely visited. Ben, who loved nature, was excited. He loved exploring new places, and this forest was special to him. Emma, though quiet, was just as curious, but she had always been a little cautious. She didn't talk much about it, but there was something about the stories she had heard from the town that made her feel uneasy. They had heard strange gossip from the people in town. Some said the forest was haunted. Others claimed people who went too deep never came back. Ben laughed at these stories. People just like to scare each other, he said. But Emma wasn't so sure, and she kept quiet. She trusted Ben and thought that maybe, just maybe, the stories were just that, stories. As they packed their bags and set out, the day felt normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the trail was easy to follow. But as they walked deeper into the forest, Emma began to feel a little strange. The sun seemed to be setting faster than usual, and the air felt colder. The birds, which were noisy earlier, had gone silent. She smelled something odd, something she couldn't quite place, but she didn't say anything. She didn't want to ruin the trip for Ben. By the time they reached the spot to set up camp, the sky was already dark. Ben, always the optimist, quickly got the tent ready and lit a small fire. "This is going to be great," he said with a smile. Emma nodded, but deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The night was colder than expected. They sat around the campfire, telling stories like they always did on trips. Ben told a funny story about a bear that scared him during a hike. Emma laughed, but she couldn't stop looking at the dark trees around them. There was something about the way the shadows moved that made her nervous. "Let's tell some ghost stories," Ben said, his eyes shining with excitement. Emma smiled, but didn't feel like telling any stories. Ben, always full of energy, started talking about an old legend from the town. He told her about a man who disappeared in the forest years ago and was never seen again. They say his ghost still walks around, looking for a way out, Ben whispered, trying to scare her. Emma shivered, but not from the cold. As they sat by the fire, strange sounds started coming from the forest. At first, it was just the wind rustling the leaves. But then, there were soft whispers. It was faint, almost like a distant voice calling their names. "Did you hear that?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. Ben waved his hand. "It is probably just the wind," he said, trying to sound confident. But even he looked a little uneasy. The night grew darker, and the sounds got stranger. Emma tried to sleep, but couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her and closed her eyes, hoping morning would come soon. The next day, Ben wanted to explore deeper into the forest. "Come on, Emma. There is so much more to see," he said. Emma hesitated. She didn't want to go any deeper, but she didn't want to disappoint Ben either. As they walked further, the trees grew taller and the path became harder to follow. Strange carvings started appearing on the trees, symbols Emma had never seen before. "What do you think these mean?" Ben asked, curious as always. Emma shook her head. "I don't know, but they don't look friendly." The deeper they went, the more the forest felt alive. The air was thick, and the silence was heavy. Suddenly, they stumbled upon a small, old cabin, hidden among the trees. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Outside the cabin, they found strange objects, animal bones, rusty tools, and old trinkets. Emma felt her heart race. "I don't like this place. Ben, let's go back." Just as they were about to turn around, a man appeared from behind the cabin. He was tall and thin, and his clothes old and dirty. His face was pale, and his eyes looked empty. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a voice that sent chills down their spines. Ben, always the brave one, tried to speak, but the man's presence made it hard to talk. He seemed to blend into the shadows around him, moving too quietly for a normal person. The man didn't say much, but what he did say was enough to make them both uneasy. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "This forest doesn't like visitors." Emma felt her blood run cold. Ben, trying to stay calm, thanked the man and said they would leave soon, but the man just stared at them for a moment, before disappearing into the trees, as quietly as he had appeared. After the encounter with the stranger, Ben and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. What did he mean? Emma asked, her voice trembling. Ben tried to laugh it off. He's probably just trying to scare us, he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. The forest felt different now. The trees seemed to close in on them, and the wind carried strange whispers. As they walked back to their campsite, the atmosphere had shifted completely. A sudden gust of cold wind blew out of nowhere, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Emma's heart was racing. She couldn't stop looking over her shoulder. When they finally reached their campsite, they were shocked to find that it was destroyed. Their tent was ripped apart, and their belongings were scattered everywhere. There were strange marks on the ground, like claw marks, and symbols scratched into the trees around their site. What happened here? Ben asked, his voice full of confusion. Emma didn't need to answer. She knew that something in the forest had done this, something that wasn't human. Panic started to set in. Emma wanted to leave, but Ben was determined to find a logical explanation. It was probably an animal, he said, though his voice wavered. But Emma knew this wasn't the work of any animal. The marks were too strange, too deliberate. We need to get out of here, Ben, she said, her voice shaking. As they gathered what little was left of their belongings, the sounds in the forest grew louder. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was something else, something that felt alive, something that wanted them to leave. Ben tried to stay calm, but Emma could see the fear in his eyes. The once brave and confident Ben was now just as scared as she was. The sun was setting again, and the forest became darker with every passing minute. The trees, which once seemed welcoming, now felt like they were trapping them. The air was thick with tension, and every sound made them jump. Emma's heart was pounding. She could feel the forest closing in on them. Night fell quickly, and the forest became a maze of shadows. Every path they tried to follow seemed to lead them in circles. The deeper they went, the more lost they became. Emma's fear turned into full-blown terror. The trees seemed to twist and move. The air felt heavier, and strange whispers filled her ears. She couldn't tell if it was her imagination or if the forest was really alive. "We are going the wrong way," Emma said, her voice full of panic. But Ben wouldn't listen. He was determined to find a way out. Even though it was clear they were lost, as they argued, the forest seemed to close in on them. The once friendly atmosphere was now cold and unforgiving. Emma's fear started to affect her mind. She began to see things, shadows moving where there were none, strange figures in the distance, whispers calling her name. She tried to keep it together, but the forest was getting to her. Ben tried to comfort her, but even he couldn't hide the fact that he was scared. Then, without warning, they heard it, a low growl, deep in the forest. It was unlike any sound they had ever heard. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something bigger, something more dangerous. Ben and Emma froze. "What was that?" Emma whispered, her heart racing. Before they could react, the growl came again, louder and closer. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the trees around them seemed to tremble. They had to run. Without thinking, they took off, running as fast as they could, through the dark forest, but the creature was following them. They could hear it, crashing through the trees, its inhuman snarls filling the night air. Every time they thought they were getting away, the forest would block their path. Fallen trees, steep drops, or dead ends. It was like the forest itself was trying to trap them. Emma's lungs burned as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest, but no matter how fast they ran, the creature was always just behind them, a terrifying presence in the darkness. They stumbled into a small clearing, out of breath and terrified. The growls stopped, but they could feel the creature watching them. From the shadows, Ben and Emma stood frozen, not knowing what to do. The silence was deafening. Then, slowly, the creature stepped out of the trees. It was massive, tall and muscular, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its sharp claws glinted in the moonlight. Ben stepped in front of Emma, trying to protect her, but they both knew there was no escape. The creature let out a low growl, and Emma's heart stopped. This was it. There was no way out. But then, just as the creature was about to attack, something strange happened. The wind picked up, and the trees around them began to sway. The creature stopped, its glowing eyes flickering. It looked around, confused, as if something was calling it away. And then, just like that, it turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Ben and Emma standing in the clearing, stunned and terrified. Shaken but alive, Ben and Emma stood in silence, trying to process what had just happened. The forest was silent again, the air still and cold. They had come face to face with something they couldn't explain, something ancient and terrifying, something that didn't belong in the world they knew. They didn't speak as they slowly made their way back to the trail. The forest had shown them its dark side, and they had barely survived. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they had been spared for a reason, but she didn't know why. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the sun was rising, casting a golden light over the trees. It was over. They were safe. But as they looked back at the forest, they knew they would never be the same. Something in the forest had changed them, something that would stay with them forever. Back in the safety of their small town, Ben and Emma didn't talk about what had happened in the forest. They didn't tell anyone about the creature or the strange man they had met. Some things were too strange to explain, but Emma couldn't stop thinking about it. The forest had secrets, dark, terrifying secrets that most people would never know. She wondered how many others had come close to discovering the truth and how many hadn't been as lucky as they were. In the end, Ben and Emma knew one thing for sure. The forest was more than just trees and wildlife. It was a place where the line between reality and the unknown blurred, a place where the past and the present collided, and where danger lurked in the shadows. They had ventured into the unknown, and they had survived, but the forest would always be there, waiting, watching, and keeping its secrets hidden from the world. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Please share this video with your friends and family too. Thanks.